organized faiths, and it's so much more nuanced. And you'll find that in any culture that you study at any point in time, it was never just one. It was never just one thing. It's people, combining many kinds of different beliefs. And in a lot of ways, like my personal view of, yes, there's organized religion. But I think it was Gandhi who said that in reality there are as many religions as there are people, and I think in a lot of ways that's true, because really what religion is your interpretation of the universe, your place in the universe and what the universe means, and that goes back to science. So I think we may separate it in this modern world, but I think when you really get down to it in very practical terms, when you're writing characters, and you're writing stories, and you're analyzing how people look at the world, it's really very difficult to separate the two.
All right, so I have a few. I'm going to do quick answers, but on the relationship between the divine and sci-fi, I would say I feel like I read Octavia's work early enough that she just made it clear to me that shaping worlds is divine work, and sci-fi is one of the ways we do that, and it's our responsibility to do it through our imaginations and our breath and our work and everything else. So that has not, there's no separation for me. I'm just like, oh, she told me. I believe she's my prophet, it works. In terms of how do you create your worlds, is it possible to create without race was one question. It might be, I'm not interested in doing that at all. I'm really, really, really interested in I think if there was not race, we would just focus on ableism, or we'd focus on sexism or something else. I'm really interested in identity as the place that we grab onto and look at in the face. Because what are we as humans? We are these amalgamations of identities that make us other, and it's so interesting to me. So I want my worlds to be as complex as possible, and if anything, I like to layer as many things on top and just see how much can we bear of being who we are. So I think that's fun. And then in terms of the themes in my work, it's just pleasure. Pleasure is a theme over and over again. I feel like I'm trying to bring Audre Lorde into sci-fi. The uses of the erotic is a constant in my thought process, but all of my books are sex and pleasure, and I think that's because pleasure is, it's how we recreate and procreate it, and it's also how what drives us in the world, right? We really move towards what feels good over and over and over again, and away from what feels bad. So I want to see how we make justice feel like the most pleasurable thing in the entire world, and that keeps coming up in the world.
I'm going to go really quickly. I'm too angry and black to not write about. I'm sorry, I just said the other thing is, it's one of the fear piece, perceiving people over. That's one of my favorite quotes from Amos Paul Kennedy, who's an African-American printmaker. He creates this on the fly. You got to see his stuff. If you haven't seen it, Amos Paul Kennedy, check him out. The other thing is I make stuff about fear. I was thinking about Latrice's question, and I look at the South as kind of like this haunted space, and this notion of what I call ethnographic, and how these ghosts keep popping up over and over and over again. And I was taught to actually embrace that fear, and I make fear fetishes, so we can actually reify that fear, destroy the fear, and move forward. Yep. But I'm not afraid of those particular spaces. And I think that is too angry. Yeah.
To add to the how do you not fear what you write? I think that as a writer, for me, I've always, I've written several stories that gave me horrible nightmares, that traumatized me, and probably took years off of my life. But one of the things that I know I do, there's still that urge in me to tell that story. I have to tell the story. And I close my eyes. I don't think about my mom reading it. I don't think about audience. I don't think about category. I don't think about how other people are going to receive what I'm writing. I don't think about any of that. I just close my eyes and I write and let come what comes. And then I always think, and one thing that I also do is I know that I can delete it if I have to. And I also know that I can edit. So in that way, even if I'm writing something that's terrifying, I know that I'll suffer while I'm writing it. I know it will be difficult, but I know that it's not something that's permanent. So there's that. And then, let me see, the other ones, I don't think I'd want to write a world that has no color or race. That's just a given. Themes. In terms of themes that pop up in my work, I guess the only two that pop into my head are just completely, this was monsters, I love monsters and creatures, and rage. And then in terms of how do I create worlds, I think that I like to do a lot of research. I like to look at the world that we live in. I like to keep my writer's eye open. So when I'm just outside, I will look at I'll see pigeons and consider what are they thinking, what are they doing, what are they thinking, what are they up to. So I'm very, very observant, and I think that that's one of the ways that writers can create worlds. It's just by observing the world that we live in and seeing it through the eyes of a writer, and that you're seeing more than what's there. And I think that you can train that eye to really, really see, and that becomes very useful when you're writing science fiction or speculative fiction as a whole.
Can I say something about race and character just real quick? I really feel like you don't have to separate the two. There's not like writing incorporating race or not incorporating race. Like if the character, like I'm a black female, that's who I am. Now every single waking moment of my day is not me pondering being a black female, but there's also not a point of my day that's probably not informed by that experience in some kind of way. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that every single activity that I'm like, only black women drink Dasani water. Like, what water does she drink because she's a black woman? You know, like, it's not everything is maybe directly informed by that, but I also think that what happens a lot, especially in like film, is that you'll see the only time they make the character specifically black is because they're doing something that is specifically tied to their blackness, and that's why we end up with so many like two-dimensional characters. And so I think you'll get more interesting characters when you get out of that mindset of separating like, oh, a black character versus a character. It's a character who is black. You know what I mean? And so you can think about, well, what aspects are informed by the race and what aspects aren't. But you know, each of us is a three-dimensional person. You know. But I'm a big green black as well, so I understand.
No, I don't need to. I'll go up and please. I'm always interested in the way that religion plays out in sort of imagined worlds. If you think about Lord of the Rings, there's no religion in Lord of the Rings. No one worships anything in Lord of the Rings. And yet it's kind of it's one of the worlds that's perhaps most suffused with a Christian ethos. And yet, you look at something like Game of Thrones. There's a ton of religion in Game of Thrones, and it's all just nonsense. It's literally like hearing someone talking about dancing rather than you dancing. And as far as I kind of think about it, I still think that we've got a lot of work to do for theorizing and conceptualizing how religion can play out in sort of invented worlds. I think that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of how this perhaps could be deployed, how it can inform and charge our worlds, and how we can begin to understand it. As far as the question about sort of the things that continually appear in my work, I'm an immigrant from the Caribbean. If you want to talk about the ground zero of the African diasporic nightmare, it is the Caribbean. This is where everything that becomes both North and South America is beta tested. And I think that that sort of lived repression and amnesia, in some ways, that reconstitution of the horror into a virtue. For example, 400 years of being raped into existence, one can draw the direct line between that and the fact of hypersexuality in the Caribbean. An attempt to sort of think of this trauma in a more positive way. And I think the apocalypse of the Caribbean constantly floats, drifts, fractures my work. And what that apocalypse reminds us, which is that it's difficult to remember that we're not only oppressed, that we're also vicious oppressors if given a chance.
Yeah.
And I guess I think a lot of my work always centers around how terrifying the oppressed can be when given power. Because, you know, I grew up in a country that comes out of this experiment called the New World, and when given a chance, you know, to do right, we did the exact far opposite. But also because it's a good memory that we're not heroic, we're human. And to be human means we're flawed and we're weak and we often fail people. But in equal measure, we often also come around and help people and do extraordinary things. And for me as an artist, trying to figure out how to keep both present without one eliminating the other. I don't want to write a heroic book. I want to write books where people can do heroic acts. I don't want to write books for people who are malign, but I want to make sure that human malignity doesn't disappear, because then it just becomes a heroic book. You know, to capture our full dimension of how we're often terrors and angels is what of great interest to me. Because I feel otherwise it just feels kind of like it becomes propagandistic, you know, and it becomes more a fantasy of consolation and perhaps a true engagement with our kind of flawed and imperfect and yet beautiful human selves.
We're at 7:15. Were you about to say something? No, I mean, it wasn't, I guess I should